So what we're talking about this time, it's just going to be me. And then for the next three presentations, Nina Bowen and myself are going to tag team. And we'll be splitting those up between us. So tonight, we're going to be very, very light on rock art. Basically what we're talking about is who's lived in Utah, when did they live here, where did they live, and how did they live? And that's a setup for the stuff that we want to do with the rock art a little bit later. So getting started with that, Utah residents of the past. So we have what we call the Paleo-Indians. They were here from about 12,000 BC to 8,000 BC. And that time period was quite different than it is now. It was cool, it was wet. We had the megafauna, you had the mammoths and the mastodons and the bears and the sloths and stuff like that running around in that time period. And then in the Archaic period, from 8,000 to about 1500 BC, oh, let's see here. Admit all. Oh, there's an admit all button. That's nice. So the Archaic period, we start to see Utah starting to look more like it does today. And it varies over time. There were hotter periods and there were cooler periods, but more or less, if you were back then, Utah would look a lot like today. The Archaic's broken up into Archaic 1, Archaic 2, Archaic 3. Archaic 2, which is kind of in the middle, was actually quite a hot period of time. And down in southern Utah anyway, there was supposed to be a lot of windstorms, very heavy windstorms. And so the combination of the heat and the wind was really drying things out. And the archaeological record kind of goes away during that time period. And there's a great debate amongst the archaeologists because they're getting most of their archaeology from cave sites. And the caves aren't necessarily close to resources. And so they're wondering if during this period, if people had to move out of the caves and move down to river areas and stream areas because there wasn't enough water up near the caves to survive on. And then once you get into open sites like that, it's much harder to find the record because, wind comes in and blows over the archaeology, and you just lose a lot of what they left behind. But the Archaic starts to look a lot more like what Utah looks like today. Now the transition from the Archaic to the Anasazi and the Fremont period is defined by agriculture. So originally, the early archaeologists were thinking that the Anasazi and the Fremont were probably around 500 AD. And the Anasazi keep getting pushed further and further back. So you'll see that basket maker date is about 1500 BC. And that's because they're starting to find evidence of corn coming into the Utah region dating back into that time period. So they may not have been using corn extensively, but at least it's here and it was starting to be used. So they have pollen records and they have corn cob records from that time period. So that's the switch from the Archaic to what they call the formative era with the Anasazi and the Fremont. And then we've got the Nunamik-speaking people, the Utes, the Paiutes, the Shoshone, and they're coming in out of northern Mexico. They're coming up from California and they're coming into this region, and they're coming in around 1200 AD, and of course they're still here. And then the latecomers in this area are the Navajo. They're coming down from my old homeland from Canada, and they were working their way south. They're Athabascan speakers. They're the same kind of linguistic group as the Apache. And they're probably in small numbers coming in around 1500 AD, but the large majority of people are coming in the late 1600s and 1700s. And they were originally hunter-gatherers as well. But once they met the farming cultures that were here, they took up farming, corn, beans, and squash. And then once they got in touch with the Spanish, they started herding. And so that completely changed their lifestyle. So those are just some quick dates and kind of some people who have been here. Okay, there we go. Now the second question is, how did everybody get here? And I actually have a simpler slide than this that I use for my other classes, but I thought you'd be interested in some of the details. So the idea that most people have used is, let me see if I can do this, annotate, is this one here. You can kind of see me circling it on the screen. So for a long time, people thought that people were coming across from Siberia over this Bering Sea land bridge. And I always thought of that when I was young, you know, as kind of being like a sidewalk. And it was huge. It was a big piece of land up there and coming over to Alaska. And the stuff that I've read most recently says that people were probably living in that Siberia, Bering Sea land bridge, Alaska area for about 5,000 years. And then what happens is those two huge glaciers in Canada, they start to melt. And there's one on the west and one on the east. And as they melt, they separate. And so there was a corridor that opened up between them, and the people were able to move through that corridor and come south. And again, from what I understand, they probably came right over my old hometown of Edmonton, Alberta. And so they're coming down, and you can start to see the famous Clovis site down here. Some of you have probably heard of Kennewick Man. And so we've got these people entering overland into the area. And that was the traditional view of how people got here. And so the traditional view was that Clovis was the oldest kind of site type that we had in North America. Things got really confused by this site way down here in Chile called Monte Verde. And the Monte Verde is 14,700 years old. And that basically predates the opening of the ice corridor. And so not only does it predate the opening of the ice corridor, but even if people were running through the corridor and coming down, it's a long, long ways south. And so there was a lot of consternation in the archaeological community about Monte Verde. And it was a weird site. It had a lot of water in it, and water tends to mess up the carbon-14 dating. And so a lot of the archaeologists just felt like the dating had been done incorrectly, and they finally just held a conference there. And a whole bunch of archaeologists went and grabbed materials, and they did their own dating, and they all came back and basically supported the date that they have for Monte Verde. So that told people that the overland route didn't necessarily work anymore. So the other route that looks most viable is this Pacific coastal route. And we know people were ocean savvy. I mean, people got to Australia, which was a much harder ocean voyage, by 40,000 BC. So it makes sense that people could simply be coming down the coastline. And then the question becomes, well, if they're coming down the coastline, why aren't we finding their archaeological remains on the coast? And you have to understand that with these two great big glaciers, the glaciers were everywhere, right? It was, the glaciers were all over Europe and Asia and Canada. The sea level at that time was 300 feet lower than it is today, which, you think about that. Think about how much ice that is on land. So all the water in all the oceans on Earth, 300 feet of that got moved up onto land. It's an amazing amount of glacier, of ice on land. So these people were coming down that coastline, and they were probably getting out and doing stuff along the coast, but their archaeological sites are now underneath 300 feet of water. And they've probably all been destroyed. And if they're not, you'd have to have a pretty good scuba diving set to get down and find them. So that's probably why we simply haven't found any of these sites that are getting us to these older dates down in South America. So it's entirely possible that Clovis really isn't the oldest site type in North America either. One of the arguments is that people go down, they find Clovis, and they just stop because there's no point in digging any further, and maybe we need to keep digging a little deeper to see what else is below there. All right, and well, we'll ask questions on this afterwards. Oh, I need to turn off that. There we go. Okay, so this map, and I have to thank Ben Everett for finding this map for me. Oh, and the annotations are staying on there. So many things to learn. Clear all drawings. This is what northern Utah looked like during that Paleolithic time and then down through the Archaic time. So you can see the modern lake level is the very dark blue. The light blue levels, they're roughly, they're starting about the beginning of the Archaic. And then during the Archaic, things start to dry up. But this light blue, can you see the light blue on there? Werner, just nod your head if you can, if it's clear on the screen. Okay. So the light blue, that was the original Lake Bonneville level. And that was about 18,700 years ago. And at that point in time, that was the maximum level of the lake. And it just got so high. You have to understand, water's draining. The Great Salt Lake is the lowest point in the whole region. It's the lowest point in most of Nevada, going up into Oregon, up into northeastern Utah. You've got the Wasatch Mountains, everything coming out of the Wasatch Mountains. It's all draining in here. So got 18,700 years ago, there was this huge flood. It finally broke through, and it went down into a small creek and then into the Snake River, and from the Snake River into the Columbia River, and from the Columbia River out to the ocean. But it was massive flood. So in 1 year, the lake level dropped 425 feet. So if you look at the size of how big that lake was, all of that gray area dropping 425 feet, that must have been, if there was anybody living alongside those rivers at that time, it must have been like the end of times was occurring. But again, even during the Archaic time period, you can see that middle level blue, there was a lot of water. And we had water down in the south, the Sevier Lake, this Lake Gunnison, and a river flowing from Lake Gunnison up into the Great Salt Lake. And this was just a wonderful place to live. You know, it's starting to warm up. You've got lots of plants. You've got lots of animals. There's fish in the lake because it hasn't salinated yet. And so you have all kinds of archaic remains all along the edges of where the water is. And finally, as we get into the modern stage, the lake, it gets warmer, the lake evaporates, the lake becomes smaller, the minerals and the salts stay in the lake, but the water goes away, and so it becomes much more saltier. The fish all die, and it just becomes a very different environment. But there was a lot of habitation all along these areas, anywhere along these pale blue. I think people were living there a lot. So here's another map. Here's a way of looking at this. So the Paleo-Indians, I mean, they were essentially all over the state. They're hunter-gatherers. They're moving around, even in those nice riparian areas where there's lots of water. They were probably only staying in one place for a week, maybe 2 weeks. The archaeological record shows that even in the caves, which would have been a great place to live for long time periods, they weren't staying there for very long periods of time. So the Paleo-Indians were all over the state. Barrier Canyon people are kind of east of the Wasatch, going up through Vernal down towards the Blues, and there's not much south of the Blues. There's maybe 1 or 2 sites south of the Abajo Mountains, but the Blues seem to be kind of a barrier for them, which is interesting. So the Glen Canyon people were really centered down in the southern part of the state along the Colorado River and San Juan River area. But boy, we find their rock art all over the place, and it's all the way up to Vernal. There's Glen Canyon Style 5 rock art in Vernal. So I don't think they were necessarily living up there, but they were certainly visiting anyway. And one of the theories is that they were following water routes just to kind of see where they would go. The desert Archaic, these are the people who lived out in Nevada, Eastern California, all the way here into Western Utah. They're primarily on the west side of the Wasatch, but we do see a little bit of desert Archaic in the San Rafael area, not very much. So the Anasazi, the kind of rule of thumb is that the Anasazi are south of the Colorado River, and they extend down to the area around St. George, the Virgin Anasazi. They don't get up to Cedar City, so they're not going up into that higher elevation country. They're on the west side of Utah. The Fremont really cover most of the rest of the state. And again, the rule of thumb is that they're north of the Colorado River. And we've got areas like Moab where the archaeology looks like there's a mix of Fremont and Anasazi, and also in the Escalante area where it looks like there's a mix of Fremont and Anasazi. So in the Escalante area, you'll have a Fremont pit house with Anasazi pottery in it. So they were at least trading with each other in terms of some goods there. And the Ute were kind of all over Utah. They were certainly up here in the Provo area when the original Mormon settlers came down here. They had big fish camps in this area around Provo. The Mormons and the Utes didn't get along very well, and they had a series of skirmishes, but they were all over that eastern part of the state. And once they got contact with the Spanish and got control of the horse, the Ute were really mobile, and they were going out to the plains, and they got quite influenced by, I think, plains culture, and brought some of that back here. You see a lot of buffalo in the Ute style rock art. Okay, anytime you see a nice square block like that, you know that the map is wrong. But roughly, the Paiutes, if you go south of the I-70 and you kind of go to Capitol Reef as the eastern barrier, and then they continue west through Utah, and then they keep going west. They keep going west and south. But in Utah, that rough guideline of I-70, south of the I-70 and west of I just forgot the name of the national park, but you heard me before. And then the Navajo in Utah, they just have a very sliver of the state down in the southeast portion of the state. And of course, they have the second largest reservation in the United States. So, but in Utah, they just don't have a lot of landmass. And really, we only see their rock art down in that bluff area. So just a quick comment on names. I'm using common names. Of all of the people up here, probably the only ones whose names are even close to being accurate are Ute and Paiute, and those are anglicized version of their real names. The Navajo prefer the term Dine, but they accept Navajo, which is actually kind of a Spanish word. Barrier Canyon is named after a place. Glen Canyon's named after a place. The Desert Archaic is named after a place. Anasazi is a Navajo word meaning either ancient enemies or, you know, the ancient ones, depending on how you accent it. And Fremont is named indirectly after John C. Fremont because they were found along the Fremont River in Capitol Reef. That was where the type site is. And I'm sure they didn't call themselves the Fremont, but I'm just using common names to make things easier. All right, this is a map. I thought I'd include it because it has a lot more detail from my friends at BYU. And boy, they follow that Colorado River border really quite precisely. But you can see where a lot of the, kind of important Fremont sites are within the state. The other thing with the Fremont is that the big sites tend to be along the I-15 corridor. So if you think about it, the places where we like to live, because there's good land and good water, it would probably be the same places that they like to live. So their big sites are up and down the I-15 corridor. Parowan is one of the biggest villages they've ever found. And the other big village, of course, is Five Finger Ridge, which is where Fremont Indian State Park is now. All right, so how did people live? The archaic people, those were hunter-gatherers. I should move back. So the Paleo-Indians, they were hunter-gatherers as well, but they were really hunters and then gatherers second. And so they were surviving a lot on small game. They were catching rabbits and grouse, and they were hunting deer and antelope and things like that. Not a lot of megafauna, but maybe some. And they were doing a little bit of gathering, but it wasn't an important part of their diet. And then much of the rest of the thing here, except for the rock art, is the same for the archaic. When we get into the archaic, they really do transition. So they're less hunters and they're more gatherers. So they're gathering a lot of seeds, a lot of nuts, and then they're supplementing that with game. And again, it's the same kind of thing, a lot of small game and a lot of mule deer and antelope and maybe sheep. The exception to that they found is at Sudden Shelter. And some of you have probably been there. It's in Fremont Indian State Park, and it's just this narrow little cave. It looks like it's about 6 feet across and 2 feet deep, but it must have been much deeper at some point in time. There's 7,000 years of occupation at Sudden Shelter. And when they did the archaeology there, there was a lot of game animals, a lot of sheep and deer there. But that makes sense because they were a lot higher elevation. Oh, I've got to let people in. Admit all. We have to figure out how to do this, Werner, so that we can have more than one person. Okay. Sorry to the people who've been waiting. Okay. Anyway, the archaic people, they didn't have permanent structures. They were constantly on the move. They weren't staying in places much more than a week or two. So they were probably doing brush shelters or staying in alcoves. They had the atlatl, which is a spear. They had darts and basketry. And the rock art really varies significantly between the groups. So you get everything from tick marks to really sophisticated painting and pecking. So it just depends on the group in terms of what they're doing and what their style looks like. The basket maker Anasazi, they were hunter-gatherers with farming. So this is, again, think of this as the introductory period when farming is started. They've got corn, they've got squash, they probably don't have beans yet. They're living in pit houses. Again, they've got the atlatl, the dart and basketry, and they've got large pectin painted panels. The Puebloan period for the Anasazi, they're really heavy into the farming by that point in time, and they're supplementing that by hunter-gathering as well. They have surface towns, so they've moved from pit houses to villages that are built on the surface. And they have kivas, which are below ground structures, probably used for ceremonial purposes, although I think they were used on a daily basis as well. And then in the late period of the Puebloan, they start moving into the cliff dwellings. So we call that the Puebloan III period. And those cliff dwellings become highly defensive areas, and they may also have been built to protect water sources. But that's the kind of the very end of their time period here in Utah. The bow and arrow comes down from Canada in about 500 AD. So that's getting into the Puebloan period. They have very sophisticated pottery, and they have basketry. And I find that the rock art in the Puebloan period declines in size and sophistication. And I have a personal theory about that. It has no factual basis behind it. But I just think that the kiva became more important from a ceremonial standpoint, and that rock art becomes less important. And so the rock art becomes, in my mind, less sophisticated. They're still large panels, but they don't have the complexity that the basket maker panels seem to have. The Fremont are a lot like the Anasazi. They're hunter-gatherers. They probably relied on farming less over their whole time period than the Anasazi did. They lived in pit houses. They never really developed much above ground structures. They had the bow and arrow after it came down from about 500 AD. They had the atlatl. They had basketry. Their pottery wasn't as sophisticated as the Anasazi pottery was. So they had corrugated and grayware pottery with some black on white. And they had large pecked and painted panels. The Nemec speakers, the Ute, Paiute, Shoshone, they reverted back to that hunter-gathering lifestyle completely. So they didn't farm at all. They weren't agricultural people. And as a result, their structures were all temporary. So they used wickiups and they used teepees. And wickiups are basically where you're just taking, brush and you're setting it up on a framework and making yourself a quick temporary little house that you can stay in. They had the bow and arrow, the basketry, and of course the horse. And again, the horse changed everything. You can think about the horse. The horse back then was probably their equivalent of our tank. It was highly mobile. They could really move quickly, and it completely changed warfare. It probably changed hunting too. So that was a big deal for them. And in the rock art, we've got painted and pecked panels with some modern themes. For example, at Fremont Indian State Park, there's a nice rock art panel that's really hard to get to, and I don't think they allow people to go there anymore. But it has one of the a Ute chief who had gone to Kansas City on a train to sign a treaty. And so he came back and he drew a picture of the train, and he drew a picture of these two-story houses that they had in Kansas City. And so kind of some fun modern rock art there. And the other thing that I find is that they often mimic the themes that they see at other sites. So they might go to a Barrier Canyon site and try to do a kind of a Barrier Canyon themed image that they've added to the Barrier Canyon site. But they've got some absolutely spectacular sites. So if you think about Newspaper Rock State Park down in southeastern Utah, it's just a gorgeous rock art site. And that's primarily a Ute rock art site with a little bit of Fremont on it. All right, just some quick pictures of some basketry. These are both from the little museum at McConkey Ranch. And if you're ever there on a weekend and Jean McConkey is wandering around, just tell her you're a rock art person and that you would like to see inside her museum, and she'll let you in. I think the basket on the right is kind of a winnowing basket or a seed collection basket. Up on top, these are pots from Edge of the Cedars Museum. All these pictures are from Edge of the Cedars. And we'll sometimes talk about corrugated pottery. And so these two pots in the back are examples of corrugated pottery. And what they did was they kind of took their thumbnail and stuck it in all over the outside of the pot. And for a long time, archaeologists couldn't figure out why they were doing that, if it was decorative or what it was. And finally, some smart person said, what they're doing is they're increasing the surface area of the outside of the pot. And so when you put the pot in a fire or close to a fire, it's transferring more heat from the outside of the pot to the inside of the pot more quickly. So in essence, the corrugated pots were the ancient version of a microwave oven. And down here, we've got a bunch of examples of sandals and this absolutely gorgeous sandal in the bottom right, which is just spectacular. So sandals were something that the Anasazi wore. The Fremont, by and large, didn't wear sandals. They wore moccasins. So that's one of the ways that you can think about by sites. And when they go into the Archaic, the sandals change over time periods. And so it's a great dating technique that the archaeologists use. More sandals. Okay, here's some pottery from southeastern Utah. And this style in the top left, this Abajo red on orange, this was a really popular style in the Four Corners, and it was produced in the Blanding area, and it was traded all over the Four Corners area for about 200 years. And then you can see a bluff black on red, which it looks similar, but it's a slightly different style on the bottom right, but from the bluff area. All right, so I wanted to show you a picture of a pit house since we talked about these, and this is a recreation at Fremont Indian State Park. And it looks pretty obvious, you know, what they would do is they would dig down into the ground, they would put rocks in around the area to create kind of a stable wall, and then they would put log beams over the top, and uh, and that would give it a little bump on there and a little bit of extra room. Here in Utah County, I was reading a book on the history here, and when the early Mormon settlers came in, there were so many Fremont pit houses in the good farming lands that they actually had one person whose job was to go and remove the mounds. And that's what they called it. So his job was simply to go and level out the land so that the farming was easier and get rid of the pit houses. But here's what a pit house looks like today. This is actually down in southeastern Utah in Montezuma Canyon. And I know it's a pit house because it was a good archaeologist who showed it to me. And you know, it's hard to tell, but you're looking for a circular formation with rocks. You're looking for rocks that are standing up on edge. And then the other defining characteristics are if you can find physical artifacts, if you can find lithics, which are stone tools, or chip tools, or pottery around. That's a nice combination of things. They had a lot of storage cists. They didn't always use above ground granaries. And again, you can see here, the one on the left is more typical than the one on the right. So it's underneath an overhang. They've dug down. They've lined the cist with flat rocks. So again, as soon as you see rocks standing up on edge, that's something that you always want to take a close look at. And then they would have covered that, and they would have stored granary or other things inside that storage cist. The one on the bottom right is just a weird one, and it's out near a rock art site that probably most of us have been to, although it's eroding away into a creek. And it's small, and it's just in the middle of nowhere, and it's not under any protective covering, and I don't know what its purpose was, but it's certainly obvious. This is the famous house on fire. And the reason I put my tab in here about, you know, don't get freaked out by the walls is because, you know, we look at that and we say, oh, well, there's walls there. That must mean that these are habitation sites. And they're not. These are all just granaries. So they're structures that they've built, and they would have put pots inside with corn in it, and it would have just kept them protected. Here's another one that I visited last summer with my parents. And I mean, if you'd have asked me, I'd have bet money that this was a habitation site. It's big, but it's not. It's a 3-room granary down in just this secluded little alcove hidden underneath it. The fields were about 300 feet above us, and just these huge open fields where they were probably gathering rice grass and corn. So again, you have to be careful. Even though you see big walls, they might not be habitation sites. This is a type of architecture that was used in the Pueblo II period by the Anasazi. This is from Grand Gulch, and this is called Wattle and Daub, and it's kind of a cheap style of architecture. So what they're doing is they're putting up sticks vertically, in essence, kind of like our 2x4s in a house. And then they're taking mud and they're rubbing it over the top of those sticks to create a very easy wall. So this was used for earlier Puebloan era above ground shelters, and you basically had to do this in some place with um, some kind of shelter up over the top of you because it would just wash away if it got a lot of water on it. Now we're moving into that Puebloan III period where this is a structure, it's a habitation site, and they start to get put into weird places where it's hard to get to. So they look like they're defensive. They're oftentimes in alcoves where there's a spring. And so it may have been that they were protecting water sources. You can see that the quality of the work is much better, but they're using a lot of mud here to keep the stones in place. If you've ever been to Chaco and you're down at Pueblo Bonito and you look at those absolutely fantastic ruins down there, it's all dry laid, and they're simply using small rocks and big rocks to make perfect walls without any mud. You know, those were masterpiece walls that they were doing in Chaco. Here's Nina going up to another one again in one of these nice deep alcoves. Probably a Pueblo III structure again. See, they're moving up here. They're moving away from the field. So typically in Pueblo I and Pueblo II, they would have been building their communities down closer to where the corn was growing. And they would have had irrigation and canals and things like that for the corn. So they wanted to be close to where they were doing all the work. Here they're moving away from the corn into other locations. This is a kiva, and the kivas are always built below ground. There are a few examples where they're partly below ground and partly above ground, but most of the time the kivas are built so that the top of the kiva is level with the surface area of the ground. They generally have 5 pillars. Let me see if I can get my drawing going again. So here's a pillar here, here's a pillar here, and there would have been other pillars that we probably can't see just because of the angle I'm at. And what they would do is they would then lay big logs across these pillars from pillar to pillar. Then they would put smaller lumber over top of the logs, and then they would put dirt and mud on top of that, so that when you were walking across it, it was just like walking on the ground. You wouldn't even necessarily know that there was anything beneath you. And then down here, these walls, they often were plastered, and you can still see signs of plaster on those walls. And then they were typically decorated. And this is partly why I think that the rock art changes in that Puebloan period is I think they were spending a lot more time kind of decorating the walls inside the kivas rather than artifying the rock around them. I used a good term for you, Eckhart, if you're on here. Okay, clear. How do I stop that? Mouse, that's what I want. Okay. So what happened to the Anasazi and the Fremont? Both of them left, well, I shouldn't say left the state. We don't find evidence of the Anasazi and the Fremont living in Utah after about 1300 AD. Up in Vernal, in some really remote areas, poor places to live, there's some Fremont archaeology that goes to about 1450 AD. So that was probably the last outpost for the Fremont. The Anasazi, starting in the very southernmost part of Utah, we 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 don't see signs of them living there after about 1200, and further north they're gone by about 1300. We have a pretty good idea that the Anasazi moved. They moved down to the New Mexico area along the little Rio Grande River, the little Colorado River down there, um, into where the existing Puebloan people were already living. And the reason we think that's happening is because we can see population sizes changing. So as as our population is diminishing here, population is rising there. The weird thing that happens is they're not bringing cultural affiliation with them. So they're not bringing local pottery or local weaving or local basketry designs with them. When they go to the new areas, they're picking up those the way they do things there, which is interesting. We don't know exactly what's going on there. We don't know what happened to the Fremont. So there's some theories that the Fremont moved north to the Yellowstone area and then eventually moved east and south down to southern Colorado, but we don't really know. And it could be that they did pick up and move. It could be that as the Nunavut speaking people were coming in, that they simply joined up with the Nunavut speaking people. And again, there'd been a huge long drought here in Utah. Agriculture had become really problematic. And it might be that they simply said, you know what, this lifeway isn't working for us anymore. So we've got these new people coming in, they're hunter-gatherers. We're just going to join up with them and follow their way of being. And therefore we lose kind of their cultural symbolism because they're mixing in with the Nunavut speakers. But there were a whole bunch of things that were happening in that time period. So, you know, we talked about those Pueblo III defensive dwellings. The Nunavut speaking people are coming in, and there were other possible internal threats. So we see granaries that get put in really weird places, like way up high on the cliffs. So, you know, it could be internal. There could have been fights over food and water, even between people who were still living here. They had a severe 50-year drought that really stressed the area. Arroyo cutting is where, you know, normally you have a stream that just kind of flows along on the top surface of the soil. And then every so often something happens where the stream starts to cut into the soil. And I'm sure you've all been out in the desert and you've seen these places where the stream's going and there's just this 15-foot straight down cut into the soil, and it makes it really hard to cross the stream. And the geologists can actually date that, and they can tell periods when arroyo cutting was happening and when it wasn't. And it started to happen in this late time period, 1300s. So the problem is, if you're relying on corn and you have a lot of irrigation systems set up, and all of a sudden the river you were using for irrigation is 10 feet lower than it used to be, that makes irrigation really hard to use. So that may have been another problem. There was huge population growth. So, you know, the population was at its max in about 1200 AD. People were more sedentary because they were living in villages and they were taking care of agricultural stuff. And so they may simply have been using up all of their resources, all of their local resources in the areas that they were living in. You know, structures, pit houses and above ground structures where they were using trees took a huge amount of resources. A pit house really required a lot of trees to make. We had the cultural collapse of Chaco in the 1100s, and we don't really know what Chaco was, but it had some kind of important pull on the Anasazi community. We know that there were roads that were built from Chaco going out to all kinds of outlying areas. And that in and of itself really causes me to think, because if you're building a road, you have to have significant number of people working to do that. And there has to be a reason for that, even if it was purely symbolic. The development of the Kachina cult was happening down in these larger pueblos, again in the Arizona, New Mexico area. So a different kind of a religious type of thing. And again, it could be combined with the drought, and people were saying we need a new way of practicing a religion, and those guys have it. And again, we had climate change overall. We had a little ice age that was occurring. So it could have been any one of these things. It could have been two or three, or it could have been the whole bunch of them. But, there was just a lot of stuff happening. And by 1300, we have really lost evidence that the people who lived all over this state were here anymore. They're gone. Okay, so I had to throw in one rock art picture for you, and I decided to include one that had a great anthropomorph with a wonderful shirt. Where's the Cheeto shirt these days? Does anybody know? Does somebody have it? Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, so this is just the last slide. It's Rochester Creek, one of the great rock art sites here in Utah. I've included my email at the bottom. So if you have questions, please feel free to send me an email and say, Troy, I want to know more about this, or where did you get that information from? And I'll try and help you. Otherwise, that's the end of this presentation, and we can turn the time over to questions. Let me see if I can unmute Werner and Nina. There we go. Okay, both Werner and Nina can speak up here.
Okay,
Thanks,
so
Troy.
Jen had a question about where did you get your maps from?
Okay, which map? The Lake Bonneville map?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a reference on the bottom of that page, and I can share the page if she'll send me an email, and then she can find that. Actually, though, I feel bad because I asked Ben for this map, and he did a lot of work to find the map for me. And then today I was wondering I wondered when the flood had happened in Lake Bonneville, and so I went to Wikipedia and looked up Lake Bonneville, and they had great maps there too. So if I'd been halfway smart, I could have saved Ben a lot of time.
So I have a question for you, Troy. On those maps, you had the Lake Bonneville level, and then you had an intermediate level, and then you had the level that it is today. And I'm wondering if you can remember how long of a period that intermediate level was.
Yeah, I think by the end of the Archaic, it's pretty much down to the Salt Lake level, although, the climate's never the same, right? The Great Salt Lake is growing and diminishing all the time, but I think the Great Salt Lake by the end of the Archaic was pretty close to where it is today.
Okay. Have you got something, Werner?
No, I don't have anything. I think those are the only questions so far. So I think must have been a pretty good presentation, Troy.
Either that or I just confused everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next presentation, which is what, 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, I think
Roughly.
we're tentatively said the 22nd now.
Okay. So that one's going to be on Archaic style rock art. So we're going to look at Glen Canyon style 5, Barrier Canyon, West Desert Archaic, and what am I missing? What's the fourth one? Anyway, whatever it is, we're going to do the four archaic styles, and we're going to try and help you think about what are the characteristics of the style. And David's going to jump all over us because he'll know Barrier Canyon way more than Nina and I do.
That's for sure.
All right, so that's the next one.
We'll be sending out an email invite like we did for this one, and also you can check on the website. We'll open it up for registration there as well, right, Troy, like you did this time?
Yeah, so I think we'll open up the registration for the next one probably tomorrow or the day after. We wanted to wait until after this one so that if there were technical issues with people signing on, that we could get those fixed and put in better instructions. So if you have any clarifications or requests for how we can make it simpler or easier to log on, just let us know and we'll try and put that into the next set of instructions. Otherwise, thanks everybody. Good night.
Yes, thank you. Good night.